What frustrates you most about this conversation of racial reconciliation?
I feel like a lot of people are afraid to talk about the issues or really dig deep and listen and hear people and understand and hear people's hurt, to understand what's going on and why have we gotten this way. We don't want to deal with the response. We don't want to deal with how it's going to affect, if it's going to improve, and things like that. But I feel like the first step is to just have conversations like this where it may hurt.
Number one, we need to get out of denial. I think we're in denial. When I say denial, I'm talking about the church collectively and corporately. I think that we need to get out of denial thinking that everything is fine. Everything is not fine. Clearly, there is a racial divide in the church. And I think we need to seriously look at that. And after we get out of denial and recognize, look, we got a problem, then I believe we need to have some open, honest, frank, transparent discussion. A lot of times, from the local church all the way up to the highest levels of the church, oftentimes, particularly in board meetings and whatnot, we're not transparent. We skirt around issues. There may be meetings before the meetings or meeting after the meetings or meetings during the lunch to decide. But in terms of an open, honest, frank discussion, that's very, very rare in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We need to deal with the issues, okay? Why does this group feel this way? Why does this group feel that way? And how can we bring unity? How can we bring harmony to all the different diverse groups in our church?
I used to think that kind of the preferred thing for me to do was to get out of the way. So my kind of favor to the scenario is to not object, give space, and stand to the side. I've come to think that that's the wrong move.
Man, I realized that we talk about racial reconciliation when something negative happens, or when it's Black History Month.
We react.
We react. We're not proactive. We're reactive, right? Something racist appears on social media. That's when we start talking about racial reconciliation within the church. But it's never really like us actually just being proactive and going forward and actually saying, yo, this is something that we need to handle. It's almost as if we're only doing it because we have to, not because we recognize that it's a necessity, and every person needs equality in our church.
Okay, so we need to talk about it. But many deem this topic a political one, therefore not appropriate to discuss in church.
When we see humanitarian effort as political, it not only compromises the actions of those who are the advocates, but it also seeks to pigeonhole them or to label them incorrectly based on partisan awareness or partisan loyalty. Was it political? No. It is biblical that the advocating on behalf of other human beings who are being oppressed because they are not in positions of power or control, that is not a political thing. It is a biblical thing. And I would even suggest, based on the minor and major prophets of the Old Testament, it is a biblical mandate.
There are many people who do want to engage in this awkward conversation, but just don't know what that looks like. Jasmine had a really neat story that I thought was a good model for what this conversation should look like.
So at this particular day, we were at potluck, Sabbath, and we were searching for a table to sit at. And this table had some empty seats. So we went and sat with this family who was white. And so we began talking. When he asked me, I don't really get into the race. I don't really get into that. What's the big deal with the Black Lives Matter? And what's the deal with all the shootings? So I began to ask him, well, sir, do you believe Black Lives Matter? Let's start with that. And he kind of just looked at me as if like, did you really just ask me that? And he was like, yeah, I believe all lives matter. And I said, no. Do you believe Black Lives Matter? Because if you did believe all lives matter, Black lives are a part of that, period. And he was just kind of shaken up a little bit, and he continued to explain his theory on that. And somewhere down the line, he got to him saying that, my boys' lives matter too, though. Like if my boys went and got shot somewhere, the same place that someone else got shot, I would want them to matter just as much. So that is when we got into the conversation of white privilege. And I asked him then, well, let me ask you this, sir, do you believe in white privilege? And at this point, his wife is like beet red. And she's like, oh my gosh, what, honey? But we were both genuinely, and what I should say about it is that it was no hostility in the conversation. And that's what I appreciated about it. It was just two people from two totally different cultures and backgrounds and understandings of issues trying to come together and understand. So at that, he said, yes, I do believe in white privilege. And I think at that moment was just like a Watergate opening of, finally, someone who admits that there is a disconnect here and there is a divide, and we happened to be in the church.
We still have some realities that we often don't like to embrace and don't like to acknowledge. And one serious reality that we're dealing with is the reality that we are in a church where the voices that count and the voices that matter are basically European voices.
See, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the most diverse church in the United States, and there are over 215 countries represented in the church, which actually would make white people the minority. But you would never guess that based off our leadership.
We want to say we're in a post-racial society when the Adventist Church has not had a black General Conference president yet. It, to me, it's amazing. We have great black administrators and leaders, but where is that? Where is the actual evidence to that?
And so the whole idea is that the thinking of the church has to be done by the whites in the church.
It's concerning. And so it'd be great for all of us to say, let's sing Kumbaya. But the reality is that's not the world within our church that we live in. We often talk about integration. Let's come together, integration. Let's stop all the segregation. Integration is shared ideas. Integration is shared ideals. Integration is not the less dominant culture merely taking on the persona or the will of the more dominant culture, and all the sake of democracy. Okay, this is what we have. Well, it goes back to that nominating committee room. If you got 10 people part of this in 5 years, well, we outvote you, so you take and accept, what we voted and what is given. That's not integration. Integration is let's talk, let's sit, let's have a discussion, let's pick up this, let's pick up that. It's give and take, and I think that's what we struggle with.
There are others who believe that the solution is to get rid of regional conferences or black conferences, similar to how things are done in the West Coast. But is that really a solution?
I think we need to target what the issue really is, because I go to the West Coast pretty often, preach at many churches in the West Coast, and it doesn't matter what the conference calls itself. When I go to a church in the West Coast, if it's a black church, it's a black church. If it's a white church, it's a white church. And so to say that the issue is the conference, I think that's way overstated. In fact, if anything, the West Coast situation shows why we need black conferences, because the segregation is still there. We still have not learned to live together. All right, and so rather than say let's do it like the West Coast, I say let's look where the real issue is. And so here is the issue here. I'm unapologetically black, okay, and when I talk about my black pride, it's not the same as white pride, because people often say, "Oh, if you're proud to be black, I mean proud to be white." The reason why I'm proud to be black is because as a black person, I've been taught to be ashamed of myself. Okay, and black pride for me is saying I'm not ashamed of who I am. All right, so that's what my pride is. What my pride is all about. But before even my black identity, I'm a child of God. And as a child of God, the blood that runs through me is the blood of Adam. The blood that runs through every single person in this world. More important, the blood that runs through me, the refined blood, is the blood of Jesus. The blood that is available to every single person in this world. And so when I think about my responsibility, I have to think from my socio-cultural environment, and I have responsibility to those who look like me, but ultimately I also think from a kingdom perspective. And from a kingdom perspective, my responsibility is to elevate a kingdom where all people are welcome. The individual who understands what God has called him to, what God has called her to. God has called the individual to be a reflection of his kingdom. And so when we have like-minded people individually understanding what our responsibility is. And responsibility is building a kingdom. But how do we build the kingdom? We cannot build the kingdom and turn a blind eye to issues of injustice in society.
On the subject of race, there are people that are hurting. There are black people that I don't know who are hurting, angry with me just because I'm white. They are hurting. And if I could just stop there and ask myself, what would Jesus do when he comes in contact with somebody who's hurting, whether they blame it on him or not? He'd find a way to spend himself on that. And that's what I think we need to wrestle more with.
When I went to the seminary, and you know, this was during a time when Philando Castile had been shot and killed for no reason, I was angry about that. And when I got to my class, the day after he was killed, the professor would have gone on like business as usual. Let's have prayer, let's get into the lecture. You can't do that when there are issues affecting people of color in this country. You can't just move on like this stuff doesn't matter.
And a lot of the disconnect sometimes may come from, well, I don't know why you black people are so angry, or I don't know why you white people just can't stop being racist. And those are two horrible, horrible views to have. So I felt like we needed to go back kind of to the beginning of things and move forward chronologically to understand some of the disconnects that happened.
So we're not going to run away from it. We're actually going to sit down and strategically plan, how can we show the world a better way, a different way? So it's not acquiescing to the pressure, but it's speaking to that pressure.
And it was never, and it will never be from a standpoint of, you white people need to be sorry. You guys need to say you're sorry to every black person you ever see and kiss the ground we walk on and throw roses in the air when you see us. That will never be the standpoint of what it is coming from. It's always a standpoint, always a hope of education on both sides, so that we can mend together.
Honestly, I don't think we do enough listening. And if we use Matthew 18, the Bible says that when you have issues, you present them to your brethren. The problems that we're having, I believe, in our church is that we are saying to our brothers and sisters, we are hurting. And they're like, you need to work harder. You need to pull yourself up by the bootstrap.
With the recent hurricanes that have gone about, they're saying pray for Houston, pray for the islands, pray for the southern part of Florida, because that's where the area is being affected. That's where like the disaster is happening, right? And so someone gave the example of like, well, pray for all states because all states need prayer. And it's like, that's absolutely true. All states do need prayer, but specifically we're talking about the one that's going through disaster. So that's why specifically praying for Houston, pray for the islands, pray for these places, because that's where the disaster is. So when they say Black Lives Matter, of course every single life matters, but the black community is under distress and we need help.
There's a history of things that have prevented us from being able to succeed and to flourish the way that we were meant to be as people made in the image of God. And what also frustrates the issue is when they turn a blind eye, when their heads are in the sand.
We got to be honest with ourselves. You know, are we seeking reconciliation as a church in terms of race relations because we're afraid of what other people think or perceive about us, or it's something internally that's very genuine, we really want to see change? What's the motivating factor? Well, we're worried about people think about us. We look, you know, idiotic, or it looks strange or crazy that we have multiple conferences and they're regional in their state. Is that the motivation, or is it really a deep indwelling of the power of the Holy Spirit that says, Lord, make us one?
I think for my white brothers and sisters who are wondering how can they be involved in all of this, how can they help with the healing process, I think it really starts with being willing to be a listener, really like taking the disposition of being a learner in all of this.
Push through the whatever stereotype or whatever you've been taught or whatever you heard, push through all of that and form a relationship with somebody who is not of the same complexion as you.
Finding a friend, finding a person who is willing to journey with you. I think taking time to link up with someone who will be patient with you and will help you see their perspective and who you can give insight into your perspective will really be very beneficial to both parties.
Because frankly, I don't feel much guilt. I don't feel guilty for being white. It's not about guilt for being a man. But we could be blind and we could be insistent wrongly.
Try to invest in some type of education system and say, this is what has happened in the past. This is what's still going on. Now, how can we stop this at a policy level?
We talk at each other and not to each other. We spend a lot of time like trying to prove a point. So it's like we're arguing what this side says or what this side says instead of listening to what's actually going on or what the conversation is actually about.
It's easy to say, I'm going to do better about it. It's easy to verbalize, I recognize that there's an issue. It's easy to say, I understand where you're coming from. But the difficulty is actually putting action behind what your mouth is saying.
And we need to see more white people actually coming to our black churches, white families, actually teaching their children that blacks have value. Don't just sit there silent. Make a stand.
The Seventh-day Adventist Church has received a devastating wound, impacting all of us. So my question for you is, what will you do about it? What sermons and programs will your church put on in order to push the conversation forward? What policies and initiatives will your university put in place in order to contribute to the solution? What will your community do in order to bring healing